This is Rodney at Extreme Vocal Studio. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how to record, process, and mix metal vocals. To do this, we're going to hear a few clips from my band Voice of Dissent's upcoming release. We're going to hear raw tracks, totally untouched, and then we're going to hear how they're processed, and then we're going to hear how you get them to sit in a mix. To help out on this, we're going to talk to the man who's handling the mixing duties on the Voice of Dissent project, and he is Greg Tomao from Tomato Farm Studios in New York. So, thanks for taking the time, Greg, and let's talk some metal vocals.
All right, awesome.
So, I guess the first thing would be, what's the first step you take in getting a track set when somebody gives you the raw material, or you just tracked a vocalist?
Well, a lot of the time when you get sent material, it doesn't necessarily mean it was tracked the right way. It doesn't mean it was edited the right way. It's important, when you care about what you do, to take a look at it and clean up the tracks and the timing. I was lucky enough that with the Voice of Dissent project that everything was done very well for the most part. I had no issues at all. You just have to make sure that there's, extraneous noise. It's getting nuked. Forget about it. It's gone. You have no choice. You don't want that stuff sitting behind the recording, because what's going to end up happening is when you compress the vocal, it's going to get pulled up, and you're just going to have this nasty gargleness under all of the mix. So
Gotcha.
Cleaning up's really important. And also, when you start a project, you need to have a vision for it. You don't, if you're doing death metal project, you don't want your vocals to sound like a pop production.
Sure.
And, if you want to go out on that limb, go ahead. But for the most part, most people in that genre, they have an idea of what they want. And you need to make sure you meet eye to eye with the artist on that.
I guess the extension of that being, what do you find are the most common mistakes that people do in tracking and in getting their vocal tracks ready?
Well, I think a really big mistake people do is they process vocals soloed. It's important to know what they should sound like soloed, but that's after you've gotten them seated in the mix the right way. And, every vocal has to be treated differently. Every microphone has different resonant peaks. Every microphone, will enunciate certain things a different way. And you also don't want to add too much high end for that reason, too. A lot of people will just, blast the high end coming out of vocals. Say, oh, it needs presence. Let me blast the high end. You don't want to do that until you know what you're working with. So make sure you take a good listen to it. Also, you don't want to overcompress vocals. It's important that they still have dynamics to them. Otherwise, it's gonna sound squashed. It's gonna sound weird. You want to limit them in a sense to get them kind of seated, and you want them to be linear to an extent, but you don't want to overdo it.
That's interesting, because I know a lot of engineers, or especially a lot of the younger crew, will tend to really, really massively compress a lot of the stuff, sometimes multiple times in a row.
For some things it works, for some things it doesn't. But overall, you're much better off using some moderate compression and automation. Automation is a pain, but it's your friend. Because if you have a line that's just not sticking out, bump it. People don't like to put in that extra effort, but that's really what it's about when you're trying to get a great vocal sound, trying to get a great vocal mix.
On a side note on that, do you have any thoughts as far as when they're actually tracking, especially like really harsh vocals, using a condenser mic versus, say, a dynamic?
I happen to like dynamics better on really aggressive vocals. Dynamics seem to be a little bit nicer when it comes to sibilance, too, which is a really big deal when you're working with aggressive vocals. They're aggressive for a reason. People usually push a bit. Even though you don't always have to, they're going nuts. And if you're going to get all those frequencies out from a dynamic, it's a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. And when you're setting up a dynamic, like if you're going to track somebody yourself, do you still use, a pop screen because of that, or do you feel that they're pretty much sufficient on their own?
I use a pop screen. For harsh vocals, I generally stick with the SM7. I just love that microphone. It's all over the place. And it has a pop screen that comes with it, but I don't use that. I use an external pop filter. The Stedman, the metal one with the holes in it's great. Or just like, you don't have anything else, you can just use pantyhose and a hanger. Does the job.
Now, while we're on the topic of that, especially because of the difference in microphones, if you're doing metal vocals that are leaning towards the clean side, maybe completely clean or a power metal type of thing, or maybe just clean with some grit added to it, does that change what mic you would pick, or do you still think you would go with the dynamic?
Well, mic choice is a pretty big deal. every singer's voice is different. It's important that you realize that. I was trying to talk about that before. You can use a condenser or a dynamic with a little bit more, of that kind of range vocals, but it really depends on the mic in question. You may pop an SM7 in front of someone and say, oh, it doesn't really sound good. It's not working out for their voice. Maybe they have a little bit more of a lower mid-ranged voice, and it would benefit more from a condenser. Mm-hmm. It really depends. Also depends on your room. It depends on the singer's mic technique. If a singer has bad mic technique, I would go for a dynamic over a condenser without a doubt.
Now, when you've got the vocal pretty much straight and you've cleaned it up and everything, what are the first steps that you'll take as far as processing, or even probably the step before that, deciding on what kind of processing is going to go, especially on the heavier stuff?
Well, we talk about sibilance a lot, and it's because it's a problem. Even in professional recordings, a lot of the time, you may not notice it at first, but if you listen for it, you can hear some really extreme clamping going down on S sounds. And it varies from recording to recording. It depends on the singer. Like, I was listening to the new Symphony X recording. Tons of sibilance on that track. And I'm just like, wow, this is ridiculous, And a de-esser is the first step. You definitely don't want to be doing any additive EQ before you de-ess, because then you're going to be in big trouble. So using a de-esser is very important, whether it be hardware or software. Right now I'm using software if needed, but hardware is the better option in my opinion. It just gives it a little bit nicer, a little more roundness to the vocal. So after that de-esser, I'll generally do my subtractive EQ. Mm-hmm. Then I'll go for compression. Then my additive EQ, and if stereo widening is going to come into play, which it does a lot of the time for backups or even a main vocal, depending on the kind of vocal mix you're going for, and then delay before reverb.
Gotcha. Now, you mentioned at two different places, subtractive EQ and additive. Can you elaborate on the difference and why you put them one before the other?
Absolutely. Now, with a vocal and with any track, there's a lot of material that isn't necessarily usable. And that's that's one of the secrets of mixing too, knowing where to get rid of stuff altogether because it's not benefiting the instrument. And for the most part for vocals, a lot of stuff below 120 hertz is completely garbage, and you may even go up higher. So if there's a lot of content in that region, you want to get rid of it before it hits a compressor. Otherwise, the compressor is going to pump because of that low end, especially if you get into aggressive compression settings. So anything you want to get rid of, do it before you compress and do further EQ. But your additive EQ, which generally is pretty slim, a lot of people boost all over the place for vocals. And boosting is very important in the high end for the most part. But for the low end, I'm doing a lot of notching. I'm not doing too much adding there because it generally doesn't need it, especially depending on how you're setting your vocal.
While you're on EQs, what do you find are like the crucial areas that most need to be tweaked, or the places that are almost a definite? I mean, every voice is different, obviously, in every mix, but generally there's usually a couple target areas. Okay.
Well, first off, like I said, I get rid of most everything below 120. And I'm going to get rid of a little bit around 200. I'm going to get rid of a tiny bit around 400. And there should be a little bit of a boost around 600 for males and 800 for females. And, depending on, obviously, frequencies as they get higher, they pertain to higher notes. So the female register is generally going to be pushed in the mids a little bit higher than the male register. And then I almost always do a presence boost around 3K, like a high shelf, and then a little bit more of a boost around 6K, again, depending on the sibilance of the vocals.
I guess probably 3 and 6 when you're adding those in or trying to dial them in. They're probably the ones that are toughest, I imagine, because that's the same range the upper end of the guitar tends to sit in too.
Oh yeah, we can go into that a little bit later about the whole guitar thing versus vocals. That can cause some real trouble.
Yeah, it's always seems to be the fight, getting one to sit in, and which I guess that would be it. I was going to say, what's the most difficult part of getting the vocal to actually sit in the mix?
Well.
Do you find that's it?
You touched upon it. Definitely combating with the guitars and the cymbals. Because your air in your vocals is sitting around where the cymbals are. And the guitars, man, it's just, it's a tracking choice too, You need to know where your vocalist is sitting. If you have a vocalist who's a tenor, and they have a lot of air to their voice and, not a huge amount of balls to it, you're going to say to yourself, if I had to choose a guitar amp for this recording, what would I use? Probably something that was lower mid-voiced, because you don't want to really interfere too much. And, when you choose the right elements for a mix, you're going to have both a nice separation and a nice cohesiveness, because you're filling out the frequency band, but you're also not combating too much. And, also you need to really think about ambience versus volume, because some people just keep pushing a vocal up, 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 up. I personally don't like vocals that sit on top of a mix. It doesn't sound right to me. It sounds like karaoke. That's a joke. If you're gonna do it right, find the natural place for the vocals and work around it. Reverb is very special, and so is delay. You could use a delay in a vocal mix and no one will even know it's there, but it's doing something. It's bringing that little extra bit out. And reverb, especially, if you're using a decent pre-delay and you have it wet enough that it's just creating a little bit of space. Reverb pushes things back, but it doesn't mean it makes them masked. It just puts them somewhere else. And also a big deal is relative brightness when you're talking about, sitting vocals in a mix. Because if you're we talked about the presence boost before, the 6K and the 3K thing. And yeah, guitars matter and your snare drum matters. A lot of engineers have said this. Listen how bright your snare is, that's how bright you want your vocals. And people screw this up all the time. I'll just listen to a mix, I'll say, what the hell is going on? I'll hear guitars that are stupid dark, and then you'll hear a vocal line that's blaring through the mix. I'm saying to myself, who thought of this when they were doing this? It just doesn't sound right. But what are you going to do?
Well, and the other thing you mentioned in the chain, and what we touched on earlier, is you talked about compressors. Can you talk a little bit about how you use them and what ones you tend to go to and why?